For over 40 years, Clara and Daniel's marriage was a symbol of stability in their quiet suburban neighborhood. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. Their house, a charming two-story with ivy creeping up the walls, stood as a testament to the years of shared memories and love they had built together. Clara, with her gentle smile and warm demeanor, was the ideal wife, always patient, always understanding. Daniel, her steadfast husband, was the kind of man who seemed to have everything under control. A successful accountant, he had provided well for their family, and his reputation in the neighborhood was impeccable. People admired their partnership, often remarking how they seemed so in sync with one another, like they could finish each other's sentences. They had raised 2 children, who, having grown up and moved away, left Clara and Daniel to enjoy their golden years together. The days were simple. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks around the neighborhood, and the occasional dinner parties with friends. For Clara, life was predictable, comforting, and full of routine. She had always believed that their marriage was built on trust, that nothing could come between them, not after all they had been through together. But even the happiest of marriages has its secrets, and Clara's life was about to be shaken in ways she never imagined. It started with the little things, the subtle changes that were hard to notice at first. Daniel, who had always come home from work at precisely 6 p.m., began arriving a little later, sometimes just 5 minutes, sometimes 20. Clara thought it was nothing, maybe an extra meeting or traffic. Yet, over time, those small delays started to feel like cracks in the armor of their relationship. Then there were the evenings when Daniel seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. Clara would sit across from him at dinner, watching him push his food around on his plate, lost in thought. It was odd, but Clara dismissed it, assuming it was just stress from his work. After all, Daniel had always been the quiet type, a man of few words, who tended to keep his emotions to himself. But lately, his aloofness had grown, like a fog settling in around them. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were the little signs, like when Daniel started spending more time in the yard, tinkering with the lawnmower or fixing a broken fence. He was always so meticulous about the house, but lately, it seemed like he was spending more time outside, away from her, than ever before. At first, she thought maybe he just wanted to be left alone to enjoy the quiet. But then she noticed that he wasn't just in the yard, he was often talking to their neighbor, Rachel. Rachel was a new face in the neighborhood. She had moved in just a few years ago, a friendly woman in her early 40s who had quickly become a part of their small, tight-knit community. Clara had welcomed her with open arms, helping her get settled into the neighborhood, introducing her to local spots, and even inviting her over for coffee. Rachel seemed nice enough, charming, easy to talk to, and always with a warm smile. But over time, Clara began to notice that Rachel and Daniel had become closer than she felt comfortable with. At first, it was innocent, just casual conversations in the yard or the occasional favor, like helping Rachel with a leaky faucet. But soon, those simple interactions started to feel more like moments shared between 2 people who understood each other in ways Clara didn't. Daniel began going over to Rachel's house more often, offering help with everything from gardening to fixing her car. Clara tried not to overthink it. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to help each other out, especially in a tight-knit community like theirs. But something about the way Daniel and Rachel laughed together, the way they looked at each other, made Clara uneasy. She had never been the jealous type, but her gut told her that something was off. And so, Clara found herself questioning everything she had believed about her marriage. Was it possible that her husband, the man she had shared her life with for so long, was hiding something? Had their perfect marriage been built on something less solid than she had ever imagined? Clara couldn't answer these questions yet, but deep inside, she knew she was standing on the edge of something that would change her life forever. Little did she know, the truth was closer than she could have ever anticipated, and the secret Daniel had been hiding would soon come crashing into her world, unraveling everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and trust. As the weeks went by, Clara found herself growing increasingly uneasy about the strange dynamic between Daniel and Rachel. At first, it had been easy to dismiss, just friendly conversations over the fence, shared moments of neighborly kindness. But as time passed, Clara noticed a change in the way Daniel looked at Rachel, a familiarity that felt too intimate for a simple neighborly connection. It wasn't just the extra time he spent in Rachel's yard, or the long conversations they had while she watered her plants, or when he helped her carry groceries into her house. It was the way they laughed together, a kind of shared understanding that Clara had never felt a part of. Every time Clara passed by Rachel's house, she noticed Daniel's car parked in front, often staying longer than he normally would if he had just been helping out. Rachel's house, a cozy little bungalow, seemed to draw him in. Clara's mind began to race with questions she couldn't seem to answer. Was she being paranoid? Was she reading too much into innocent interactions? It wasn't just the physical presence that bothered Clara, it was the emotional distance she started to feel from Daniel. He had always been a quiet man, but now, his silences were longer, more profound. Even at dinner, when they sat together at the table, Clara felt a chasm between them, an invisible barrier she couldn't bridge. She tried to reach out to him, to talk about their day, to bring up memories from their past that once sparked conversation. But Daniel was distracted, his mind elsewhere. The spark that once illuminated their relationship seemed to be dimming, and Clara couldn't understand why. Then, Clara ran into Rachel at the local grocery store one Saturday afternoon. It was a busy day, and Clara had stopped by to pick up a few things. As she turned the corner in the produce aisle, she nearly bumped into Rachel, who was pushing her cart. They exchanged pleasantries, and Rachel offered a warm smile, but there was something unsettling about her demeanor. Her eyes flickered nervously, and there was a slight awkwardness to her greeting that Clara hadn't noticed before. It was almost as if Rachel was hiding something, though Clara couldn't pinpoint what. As they chatted about the weather and local news, Clara noticed Rachel's gaze kept drifting over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone. Clara, still holding her basket, tried to brush off the feeling of discomfort that crept over her. After all, Rachel was friendly, and it was only natural to make small talk with a neighbor. But as they parted ways, Clara couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. That evening, after dinner, Clara decided to do something she had never done before. She checked Daniel's phone. It wasn't something she had ever felt the need to do. She had always trusted him completely. But now, as suspicion gnawed at her, she couldn't help herself. Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter, his attention focused elsewhere. Clara hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The screen lit up, and she saw messages from Rachel. At first, they appeared to be innocent, friendly exchanges about plans for the weekend or the latest neighborhood gossip. But as Clara scrolled back through the messages, her stomach tightened. The tone between the two of them had shifted over time. What had started as casual exchanges had slowly evolved into something more personal, longer, more intimate messages that made Clara's heart race. The messages spoke of shared moments, of private jokes only the two of them seemed to understand. There were mentions of special times spent together, and comments about how they couldn't wait to see each other again. Clara's mind began to spiral as she read more. Rachel wasn't just a friendly neighbor. She wasn't just a woman who needed help with repairs. No, it was clear now. Daniel and Rachel had been meeting in secret, sharing things with each other that Clara thought only she and Daniel had shared. And the messages weren't just platonic, they were full of affection, longing, and a sense of intimacy that left Clara feeling hollow. Clara's breath quickened, her hands shaking as she set the phone back on the counter. She had always thought of Daniel as her partner, her confidant, the man she had trusted with her whole heart. But now, as the evidence of his betrayal lay in front of her, everything she thought she knew about their marriage felt like a lie. The thought of Daniel, her husband of over 40 years, betraying her with someone else, someone who had once been a friend, was too much to process. For the first time, Clara felt a surge of anger mixed with heartbreak. How had she not seen it sooner? How had she been so blind to the growing distance between them, the signs that something was wrong? But the truth was undeniable now. Daniel wasn't just spending more time with Rachel. He was living a secret life, one Clara had never been a part of, and one she would have to confront. Clara's heart pounded as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at Daniel's phone. The betrayal she had discovered felt like a cold, hard slap. It wasn't just the texts, intimate, flirtatious words exchanged between Daniel and Rachel that spoke of secret meetings and shared longing, it was the realization that for months, Clara had been living a lie. Her mind raced, running through the last year of their life together. How had she missed it? How had Daniel hidden this from her for so long? The anger she had felt at first began to shift into a deep, suffocating sadness. She had trusted him completely. Clara had given Daniel her entire heart, had been there for him through thick and thin, and this was how he repaid her, by sneaking around, hiding a secret life with someone else. The weight of that betrayal pressed down on her chest, leaving her breathless. That night, Clara barely slept. She couldn't stop thinking about everything she had learned, replaying the messages in her mind, wondering how much more had been hidden from her. The anger would rise again, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming sadness and confusion. She hadn't just found evidence of an affair, she had found the cracks in their entire relationship, the ones that she had ignored, thinking they were just a normal part of a long marriage. The truth felt like a sharp blade, cutting through everything she had known. She had been blind to the changes in Daniel, to the subtle signs that something had shifted. And now, the facade they had built together had come crumbling down. By morning, Clara had made a decision. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The weight of the secret was too much, and it was eating away at her. She needed answers. She needed to confront Daniel. When he came home that evening, Clara didn't waste any time. She didn't offer him dinner, didn't ask him about his day. She simply walked up to him, her eyes filled with determination. For the first time in years, she was no longer the woman who would quietly forgive. She had seen the truth, and now, she would face it head-on. Daniel looked surprised when Clara spoke. He had no idea that she knew. He had been hiding the affair with Rachel so well, so carefully, that he thought he had been fooling her all along. But Clara's gaze didn't waver. She had seen the messages. She knew everything. Daniel's face turned pale as Clara laid out the truth before him. He stammered, trying to explain, but his words were hollow. He admitted everything, the affair, the secret meetings, the stolen moments. At first, he was defensive, trying to justify his actions, telling Clara how he had grown distant, how he had found someone who understood him in ways Clara no longer did. Clara listened, but every word he said felt like a fresh cut. He spoke of his loneliness, how their connection had faded over the years, how he had met Rachel and felt something he hadn't felt in years. But Clara wasn't listening to the excuses anymore. The pain was too raw, too deep, and all she could hear were the lies. She asked him why Rachel? Why now? Why had he done this to her, to their family? But Daniel's answers were evasive, filled with guilt but also with a strange sense of relief. He admitted that he had never intended for Clara to find out. He had been careful, trying to keep the affair hidden, thinking that he could have both lives, his marriage and his secret relationship. But now that the truth was out, there was no going back. Clara's mind raced as she processed the words coming from his mouth. How could she have missed it all? She thought back to the times when she had felt something was off, the late nights, the strange behavior, the way Daniel seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. But she had dismissed it, told herself that it was just a phase, a temporary change. Now, those little cracks had turned into an insurmountable chasm. As Daniel sat there, apologizing, Clara felt a surge of anger, but also of clarity. She had spent so many years being the supportive wife, the woman who put everyone else's needs first. But in that moment, she realized that she deserved more. She deserved honesty, respect, and loyalty, things that Daniel had failed to give her. The conversation ended in silence. Clara didn't know what the next step would be, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't continue living in the same lie. The man she had trusted for so long was no longer the person she thought he was. And as painful as it was, Clara knew she had to move forward. She had to find her own strength again, to rebuild her life without him. That night, Clara sat alone in their bed, staring at the empty space beside her. The truth had come crashing down, and everything had changed. But she was no longer the woman who would ignore the cracks. She was someone new now, someone who would fight for herself, no matter how difficult it might be. The road ahead would be hard, but Clara had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. The days after the confrontation were filled with a strange sense of numbness, as if Clara had stepped out of her own life and was watching everything unfold from a distance. Daniel, apologetic but distant, seemed unsure of how to proceed. He was still living in the house, though the space between them felt more like a vast ocean than a mere distance. Clara, on the other hand, had made a decision. She knew that their marriage, the life they had built together, was irrevocably broken. She wasn't sure how long it would take to heal, but she knew that she couldn't stay trapped in the shadow of betrayal any longer. In the days that followed, Clara became hyper-aware of her own emotions. She tried to go about her daily routines, but everything felt different. The house, which had once been a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt foreign and empty. The silence between her and Daniel was deafening. He tried to initiate conversation, apologizing repeatedly for his actions, but Clara wasn't sure she was ready to hear his apologies anymore. His words felt empty, like the hollow echo of someone who had already lost everything. The idea of leaving had crossed her mind more than once, but Clara wasn't ready to make that leap just yet. She wasn't sure where she would go, or how she would start over. She had always defined herself through her marriage, through her role as a wife and mother, and the thought of stepping away from that identity terrified her. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't continue living in this limbo. She had already spent too many years ignoring the warning signs, convincing herself that everything would work out. But now that the truth had come to light, there was no going back. As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice something unsettling. Daniel's relationship with Rachel, which had been the catalyst for all of this turmoil, was beginning to unravel as well. Clara had initially thought that Rachel would be the one to replace her, Daniel's new partner, his escape from the mundane reality of their marriage. But the more Clara observed, the more she realized that Rachel, too, was starting to feel the strain of the affair. Rachel had begun to distance herself from Daniel, not returning his calls as frequently and canceling plans at the last minute. There were moments when Clara caught glimpses of Rachel at the grocery store or out walking her dog, and the unease in her eyes was palpable. It was clear that Rachel, like Clara, had been living in the illusion of a perfect relationship, and now that the truth had come out, she was facing the same disillusionment. One afternoon, Clara ran into Rachel at the local coffee shop. Rachel, though she tried to mask it with a forced smile, seemed unusually uncomfortable. They exchanged pleasantries, but the tension between them was thick, and Clara could feel her own heart pounding in her chest. Rachel's gaze dropped, and for a moment, Clara saw something unexpected, a flicker of guilt, maybe even shame. It was almost as if Rachel realized the affair hadn't just hurt Clara, it had hurt her too. Later that day, Daniel came home to find a letter on the kitchen table. Clara had written it earlier that morning, though she hadn't quite known what to say until then. She poured out her feelings, expressing her pain, her confusion, and her anger. She told him that she couldn't keep living in a marriage where trust had been shattered beyond repair. She wasn't asking for answers anymore, and she didn't want apologies. She simply needed space to figure out what came next, and for that to happen, they needed to go their separate ways. When Daniel read the letter, he didn't fight it. He didn't beg her to reconsider. The look on his face was one of resignation, as though he, too, knew that everything had changed beyond repair. He had already lost Rachel, and now he was losing Clara. The weight of his actions hung over him, and in that moment, Clara realized that the man who had been her partner for so many years was a stranger to her now. The next few days were filled with logistical decisions: who would stay in the house, how to divide their possessions, and, most painfully, how to explain everything to their children. It was the hardest conversation Clara had ever had to have, but she knew that being honest with them was the only way forward. Her children, though devastated by the news, were supportive. They didn't take sides but offered her the love and strength she needed to keep moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself slowly reclaiming her life. The pain was still there, buried deep, but it was no longer all-consuming. She sought therapy, not just to deal with the betrayal, but to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage. She began spending more time with friends, revisiting hobbies she had long forgotten, and finding joy in the small things. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she was beginning to live for herself. As for Daniel, his life unraveled in ways he hadn't expected. His relationship with Rachel had ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. She had made it clear that she wasn't interested in being with someone who had so easily betrayed his wife. Rachel had walked away, leaving Daniel to face the consequences of his actions alone. The man who had once been so sure of his place in the world now found himself adrift, isolated and remorseful, with no one left to lean on. Clara, on the other hand, had begun to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the sadness felt overwhelming, but she was learning how to stand on her own again. She had uncovered her husband's secret life, and in doing so, she had uncovered something far more important, the strength within herself to move on, to heal, and to reclaim her own future. It was a painful journey, but it was hers to take, and for the first time in a long while, Clara was starting to believe that there was still hope for a new beginning.